Hey everyone, make sure you like, subscribe, follow us for upcoming videos and shorts that we got coming soon. I'm here to introduce my mother and also the daughter of a former captain of the Ohio State Reformatory.
Episode 4 of the Ohio State Reformatory. Disclaimer on this episode 4 because it's not all good, and there's some stories I'm going to tell you that you need to be very discreet as to who should listen and who shouldn't listen. So you make the choice what you should do, but there is a disclaimer on episode 4. The first thing I want to tell you about was Dad had to work a strike that the guards had outside the prison. That they were fighting differences of they wanted more money and more benefits, so they went to strike. And when they struck, Dad had to stay at the prison. Due to the fact that he was administrator, his responsibility was to take the place of those striking guards until they settled their differences. So Mom and I stayed at a nearby home on the grounds of the reformatory, while Dad stayed in the prison and took care of the duties that these guards were expected to do. The strike lasted for approximately 2 weeks, and they were able to resolve it, and they went back to work after that. Another thing I thought was interesting to know was Dad didn't serve just the deputy's office. He basically was asked to take over the hospital and infirmary in the prison itself. They were having some issues and problems, and they wanted to see if they could solve these problems without any issues. These problems included illegal drug distribution to the inmates, and another problem was nurses were getting too friendly with the inmates. The resolutions did occur, but it took some time to get them solved. I will let you know, some nurses lost their jobs and no longer work at the prison. Dad worked on solutions. He cleaned up the issues and the messes. He was placed back on his regular duty in the deputy's office after he did his work at the hospital and the infirmary. Now, deputy's office, I want to tell you, DO stands for deputy's office, and that's where Dad worked most of the time while he was in the prison. Another story he told me, which was kind of interesting, it was called the hole incident. He had placed an inmate in the hole for infraction that he caused while in prison. He was taken to trial from the DO and was put down into the hole. And one day, Dad decided he wanted to go check on the inmate to make sure he was okay. But you have to realize the hole is a very gloomy, very dark, very cold place. So he decided to walk down the steps, and he started to yell the inmate's name. Several times he yelled him with no responses. So Dad got worried and started walking up towards the cell, and he still didn't get any response. And Dad's yelling real loud, called out for the inmate several times, but didn't get any responses. So Dad went right up against the cell. Suddenly, the inmate opened his mouth real wide with white teeth, and he screamed, "Boo!" right at Dad against the cell block. Dad stepped back from the cell, and Dad was very startled and reached into the cell to try to reach and get to the inmate. But the inmate got smart and decided he was going to back out. Dad laughed about this story afterwards because I guess an inmate had pulled a prank on Dad, and Dad was the prankee. So he ended up getting taken care of there. Dad told another story, which is kind of a sad story. An inmate over at the wood workshop, decided to create a casket, a tiny little casket about so big. It was brown, dark brown, and it had an actual lid for it with hinges. And inside the casket, he had taken some material and had placed around the casket and glued it in. He also took some rubber tile or rubber bands, cut it the length of the actual casket, and created a person in the casket. And it was really well made and stuff like that, but of course the inmates couldn't keep it. But it fit the casket, the rubber thing. He put, like I said, he took a lot of effort into this. Now the inmate told Dad when Dad confiscated it that this was a tribute to him, because he felt that he would be leaving OSR in that casket. So it was kind of like a memorial for the fact that the inmate didn't think he'd make it out of the prison. It wasn't nice. It wasn't all peaches and cream. There were a lot of things there that the inmates worried about because, again, either you were liked or you weren't liked. There were a lot of fights and stuff like that that the guards had to keep an eye on. So, like I said, things occurred. There was one riot that occurred outside in the yard, and the inmates were out there and they were calling them back into their cells, and all of a sudden the inmates decided to do a sit-down strike or riot in the yard. Supervisors and guards refused to go out into the yard to break up the riot. So Dad, being the guy he was, he went out into the yard. He walked out to the center of the problem, and he began to talk to the inmates about their issues. Some of their issues were legitimate. One was the fact that they didn't like their food that they were being expected to eat, and they wanted more reform on it. They wanted more variety, I guess. A second thing that they wanted was more exercise time to play basketball and lifting weights and just hanging out in the yard. Inmates trusted Dad so that to resolve these issues. Dad decided to take it back to the supervisors and guards because he couldn't make the final decision of what to do. So they all met and they decided what they could do to help them out. The riot eventually dispersed, and the inmates were taken back to the cell blocks, and that ended the riot, and that was a pretty peaceful one. Dad felt that if the inmates were given rehabilitation programs, there would be less problems in the prison. So Dad was the advocate who pushed for more vocational programs, training programs for the inmates. Now, a very sad Dad told me, I call it the fire incident that occurred in one of the cell blocks. The inmates were being put back in their cells and locked in for the night. And you have to remember, when the cell doors closed, it locked the entire cell block. All the cells locked. So they were back, they stood by their door, and then the guards would say, step in or go on in. And they go in, and then the doors would shut, and then behind it, they wouldn't open. Not until next morning. As they were being put in the cells, an inmate sprayed lighter fluid all over a locked inmate's body. And then he took a match and he lit him on fire. Unable to get to an inmate on fire, he died in his cell. The guards tried to get him out, but there was just no way of getting him out. They couldn't unlock the cell block. It was too late. The inmate was charged with the killing of the inmate, and it just extended his incarceration time while at the prison. It lengthened his at OSR because of the incident. Another story Dad told me about, which I call it the scaffolding accident. They were constantly trying to renovate the prison, because the prison was getting older and more dilapidated, that they decided to do a work in a work project, and they had scaffold. And what they did was they actually put scaffold all the way up to the highest point in the cell block. Now you have to remember, Mansfield was noted for the world's highest cell block in the entire United States. So these inmates put the scaffold up, and then they climbed up on the scaffold with paint, and they were painting the top tip parts of the actual cells, the walls of the cells. As they were painting, they placed the scaffold up very quickly to work, and they kept moving it when they needed to move it to be able to paint. The sad part was it was being taken down and up and down and up, and all of a sudden the scaffold collapsed with several inmates on the top of it. They fell all the way to the ground. Several of the inmates were taken to nearby hospitals with armed guards, and they were sent there to help with their severe injuries. They took guns with them to protect them so that they wouldn't escape. They had several injuries, and several died with broken necks, and they lost some inmates with this. After they investigated this particular accident, they found out that the scaffolding was put up wrong, and it caused the collapse and the deaths of the inmates. So they had to be very careful with what they used in anything like that. Another story Dad told me was, it was called the bullpen. Bullpen was located at the bottom of the cell block. It was about 100 yards, maybe 200 yards on the bottom, that was opened up that the inmates could go out, stretch their legs so they could move, because you gotta remember, they're in a cell for X amount of hours, and they got tired of being in there, so they gave them time to just walk and to just loosen up. Well, the bullpen walk that Dad did, he'd always take a walk daily, and he'd stop to talk to some of the inmates in the bullpen. Sometimes Dad would talk about just issues that the inmates were having, or it could be job placements. He watched what he said. He told him that they would work on things to try to make it better over at the prison. One day, the sad part was, Dad was standing talking to some inmates, and he noticed an inmate running toward, like real fast, running towards him. Well, what he noticed up on the top part, his head, the neckline, he was cut from jugular vein to jugular vein, and every time the man ran, his head would bounce up and down, until the blood had come out, and he fell right at Dad's foot with his head out, and he was able to, he was down. And they caught the inmate who used the shiv on the victim, and they found the weapon that was used on the victim. Ambulance removed the victim's body because there was no way of saving him. He was cut from one side to another. It was over a disagreement that these two inmates were having. Dad went on an escape. Funny thing is, Dad never went on an escape at all. But they wanted him to go because there were some inmates, they got escaped through the drainage tunnel on the side of the prison. Several inmates hid with people near the prison. They were captured right away. So they knew to check the houses right away. But there were some of the inmates who decided to climb the trees to hide out. Dad was a hunter, and he would shoot animals up in the trees, so he liked the idea of being able to shoot up in the trees. So he decided to, all of a sudden, when he was asked to go on the escape, he shot up in these trees, and several inmates fell to the ground, and they were captured and returned to the prison. For some reason, Dad was never asked to do another escape after this one. So I guess they learned their lesson having Dad do that. We had an offer to live in one of the front apartments at OSR. he would move his entire family over to OSR Mansfield, Ohio. He thought about it and decided against the move for many reasons. He'd be too close to his work, and that was a big no-no. And he called to work all the time because he was right at the prison. Another big safety factor he had was his wife and his daughter would be there, and inmates had access to the apartment. They were able to work. They had work releases that they would clean around the facilities and outside. And Dad's choice was easier to make because he decided no, he didn't want to take a chance having his family over there and the inmates do something. So he chose not to do that. Dad had a good time over there at one time. They were taping a movie, Harry and Walter Goes to New York, and it was about two inmates who escaped from the prison and headed to New York. He met these actors who filmed this at OSR in Mansfield. One of the actors was James Caan and Elliot Gould, which while on the movie set, they actually gave Dad a movie prop. It was a padlocking key that was used on the set, and took Dad for a tour of the movie set. He got to meet, I don't know the man's name, but he was Lurch on Addams Family. He played the piano on Addams Family. Well, he played a horse-drawn carriage driver, and it drove the horse-drawn carriage driver on the side of the prison by the guards post. And what happened was, we walked with Lurch, and I never realized how tall a man could be. He was huge and tall, and as we were walking, I kept looking up at him because I was just amazed at how tall he was. The movie set designer had to build a door on the left side of the prison. It was made out of wood with explosives to blow up in front of the original door. They'd blow up the door by opening the real door wide. It looked like it was completely destroyed by the explosion. Armed guards were actually put on the inside of the door. When they opened the main door of the prison, they stood there with their guns to make sure that the inmates would not try to escape. And then as soon as it was exploded, they quickly and immediately shut the door, the real door, and making sure that there would be no escapes during the explosion. The real door closed immediately, and the scene was over for Harry and Walter Goes to New York. Now, Dad went through a lot of training sessions out away from the prison. Partially is because you have to know how to treat an inmate, and some of these training sessions showed him how to treat inmates, how to make sure that the inmates followed rules and stuff. So Dad went for additional training sessions to learn ways to cope with dealing with inmate in the prison. Dad worked over 30 years at Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio, before retiring. He shared many experiences that he witnessed during his time at OSR. Dad didn't get to experience the Shawshank Adventure due to his early retirement. OSR has been used for various movies. Some of these movies include Escape Plan, Air Force One, The Shawshank Redemption, and Harry and Walter Goes to New York. They offer tours of the prison that you can and go through. There's night stays that you can stay. Some paranormal visits and stays are also allowed. There's a gift shop and a museum. The schools tour this building. Halloween, there's a Halloween scary walk that actually does set up in October, that they take walks through the prison. one thing you got to remember, to be able to get into a prison, you had to be checked in. Visitors checked point was found in the middle of the prison, right beside the two outer edges in the front. This point was where visitors were forced to go through the checkpoint. They searched for items in their purses, their belongings, to make sure that they weren't bringing any contraband into the prisoners. A lot of these people didn't realize even carrying a simple pin or something as simple as a pocket watch or something like that, they were not allowed to bring certain things in. One time there was a woman who decided to bring a wooden fake gun that she was going to take into the prisoner, and he probably was going to try to escape with that fake gun. She wove it in her hair, and then when they got ready to search her and pat her down, they felt this object and they looked it up in her head, and there was a gun, and they ended up having to cut that out of her hair because it was so woven in, it was just impossible to get out. They were not allowed to take any sharp, blunt objects. There were birthday cakes that were attempted to be brought in, and what they did was they baked the cake, but they put knives and sharp objects in the cake. So they had to take those so they wouldn't bring them in. You couldn't bring cigarettes in only because the inmates would take those cigarettes and sell them to other inmates and make a profit on the cigarettes. So they wouldn't allow them to take any cigarettes in. A person that was in charge of this visitor checkpoint couldn't be nice. He or she was a mean person and had to be really watched, because I went over for a couple classes when I was going to college over there, and the lady took me through fingerprinting, everything, and she even took me through the padding. They have 2 private rooms that they take people in. They pat your body to make sure. They check under your legs to see if you taped anything on your body. They would have to dispose of anything that could be brought in. So they were not nice. They weren't. Even children were forced to go through the checkpoints. Some children, believe it or not, carried things in because their parents or their relatives wanted them to carry something into the prisoners. Checkpoints collected various things such as weapons, knives, shivs, and other items that they displayed on a display case. And one story I'm going to tell you, this actually happened. There was one person who tried to smuggle in 25 bags of balloons filled with drugs. They swallowed them, and then what they were hoping to do is once they got into the prison, they'd go to the restroom. They passed the balloons through going to the restroom. I guess I'm going to say it's simple, to poop them out. And once they pooped them out, they'd take them to the actual sinks and they'd rinse them off, and then they could take the bags of drugs and give them to the inmates, and they could sell them for a profit. The only problem that they ran into was this person didn't realize that some of the latex that they used for these balloons was very thin, and he was having stomach issues, and he noticed that his stomach was getting worse and worse. 2 of the bags actually punctured in his stomach, exploded, which he ran into a lot of problems. So they actually had to take him to the hospital to try to get the rest of the bags out. Well, while they were doing that, these drugs that bursted did not take into consideration that some of the balloon drugs were in latex, and they bursted into his stomach. It caused so much pain in his stomach. He passed most of the balloons, but several bursted and killed him instantly. He died by bringing these drugs into the prison. There are fundraisers for the prison. One that they're trying to do is you can actually renovate a cell, and it's what you do is it helps to pay for paints and stuff, supplies that they need for this, because the prison is getting older and older and it needs painted and taken care of. So they're trying to save that. You pay X amount of dollars, I think it was $300 to $500, and they would put you on a membership level, and the public could buy a membership, one cell, with the needed renovations and supplies to upkeep the cell every year. They were expected to upkeep it once they started it. Amounts varied. Like I said, it could be more expensive. They said once the cells was purchased, it would be up to the individual to keep the upkeep up. They wanted to keep the prison going for future generations. They are not sure if the fundraiser is going to work, but they're going to attempt to try it. Several cells have already been purchased to be able to be renovated. One thing I like about this prison, it also gives them a chance. They do what's called a Halloween walk every Halloween. The OSR opens their doors to a scary Halloween walk for the public. You purchase tickets, and what you do is you walk in small groups through the prison to various areas and corridors of the prison. Events stays open to the public over a month. This event goes for about a month in October. Many people come to OSR to be scared. Money helps to keep the OSR running. Prison is staged. They stage the areas with actors to play their scary roles. Historical Society looks into fundraising programs to help keep OSR up and running. YouTube channels, films over the OSR. The paranormal groups come over to investigate ghosts, and they have seen several ghosts in OSR. They feel that the prison is haunted. I am sure that they had to pay for their visits and their stays. And this is chapter 4 of the OSR experience. Like and subscribe to this episode chapter. I'm hoping we are going to take an episode 5, and I'm hoping to get several people to go over and to film some of the places that I've been talking to you about in this particular experience, and they'll have firsthand knowledge, able to tape some of the locations that I've talked about while doing this episode. So please sign up. Don't forget, hit that bell button. I love everyone.